Right, well, we're just waiting for a few people still to join, but welcome everyone who's already here. As you've probably seen, it's a webinar, so I won't be able to hear or see you. And if for any reason that you get knocked out of the Zoom, then you can just rejoin with the same link and you'll just join automatically. If for any reason that you feel that you can't or you've got an appointment to go to, don't worry, this is going to be recorded and then uploaded to our YouTube channel, so you can rewatch it at any time. I'm Sarah Shuttleworth, the Volunteer Manager for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. And as my co-host today, who's sort of in the background, we've got Abigail Maiden, who's the Northern Ireland equivalent of myself. And she's going to be monitoring the chat and the Q&A function for you. So I think we are a little just past 12, so I will make a start for those that are already here. So welcome and thank you for joining us today. So we very much encourage the use of the Q&A function if you've got any questions. And as I said, my colleague Abby will attempt to answer as many as possible, but however, we will also have a session for answering questions at the end between the two of us. Also, she'll be putting any sort of extra information that she feels is necessary in the chat section. And if you do have any issues with the Zoom, like one of us, you suddenly can't see one of us or something, then please do ask in the chat about that. So just to give you an outline of what we are hoping to cover here today, I'm going to give you a bit of a background about the NPMS and why it was started, then how you get started as a volunteer and leading onto the detailed methodology on how to carry out your surveys from plot selection and creation and doing the survey on the ground. I will also detail the support and the help that you can get with all these processes. The NPMS is a UK-wide citizen science habitat-based plant monitoring scheme that covers the major freshwater and terrestrial semi-natural habitats. The NPMS provides an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance across the UK's habitats through time and was designed to meet the need for a standardised approach to plant monitoring, which was identified as high priority within the Terrestrial Biodiversity Surveillance Strategy published by JNCC in 2008. The basis of the NPMS is that across the UK, monads, or simply 1 kilometre squares, have been randomly designated, and volunteers across the UK can then allocate themselves a square, or more than one, to survey twice a year. The National Plant Monitoring Scheme was designed and developed by the BSBI, CEH, UK CEH, JNCC and Plant Life. JNCC, which stands for the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, is the public body that advises the UK government and devolved administrations on UK-wide and international nature conservation. The UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology is an independent, not-for-profit research institute carrying out environmental science across land, sea and air. The BSBI, the Biological Society for Britain and Ireland, Botanical Society for Britain and Ireland, sorry, is a botanical society for anyone interested in the flora of Britain and Ireland. Recently, we also now have Northern Irish partners DARA with the scheme's expansion to Northern Ireland. The NPMS provides an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance across the UK's habitats through time, as I mentioned. In the UK, there are actually already long-standing schemes for monitoring populations of bats, birds and butterflies, for example. We've got the British Bird Survey and the British Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. But there wasn't a scheme like this that was similar for plants. So with major changes taking place and declines in biodiversity across habitats being reported, for example, through habitat change, nutrient enrichment, which is sort of nitrogen deposition, climate change and so on, it became crucial to have a better understanding of plant populations. There was and still is a need for a large-scale coverage and systematic approach. Otherwise, there's the potential to miss trends and patterns. So the 4 partners mentioned came together in 2012 to devise the scheme and the methodologies, before a pilot was then run in 2014. And then in 2015, the NPMS was launched, making 2021 the 7th year the scheme has run and data collected. Last year was a pivotal year for the scheme, as with 5 years of data under our belts, we now had enough data to start looking at trends and indicators. So as I've said, there was no robust survey for plants already in existence, so there was a need to establish this scheme. This needed to include semi-natural habitats beyond those of just within protected sites. So looking at what the data can tell us in the future, the scheme aims to provide habitat inventories and contribute to remote sensing. The aims also include investigating drivers of change using NPMS data, considering, for example, climate change, habitat management, invasive species, pollution and eutrophication, coastal management, pests and pathogens, protected areas, and animal-plant interactions. So this is just a few facts and figures for you. So we've got 408 NPMS indicator species in total. So that's if you're recording at the middle level, there are a total of 408 species. We've got 11 broad habitats, which are then defined, separated out into 28 fine habitats. We have the 5 partners that I mentioned. We have asked for 5 plots per square, but I'll go into more detail about that. We ask for 2 visits each year, and there are the 3 different recording levels for surveyors. And we have about 1,500 volunteers currently. This is again just a little infographic designed as part of celebrating those 5 years of the NPMS. Therefore, some of the numbers are out of date as we're now in our 7th year. So we have more than the 1,500 volunteers, as I said. This slide really highlights the dedication of our volunteers, as in 5 years they returned 876 monads with data and surveyed 3,977 individual plots, which is incredible. So thank you to all of our volunteers. Monitoring the NPMS habitat plots twice a year, every year, provides an unparalleled opportunity to track and understand the responses of plants to our changing environment. It allows us to investigate the growing pressures on our environment. And as I say, following our 5th season of surveys, we started to see stories emerge from the data. If you have not seen our report, Understanding the Health of Our Habitats, released last year in March, you can read the full report in full and find out more about the partners we're working with on the Conservation and Research page of the NPMS website. Another major achievement for the NPMS is the experimental indicator. So during the end of last year, DEFRA and JNCC UK Biodiversity Indicators were published. These provide an annual view of how a variety of groups of wildlife and other indicators of action for biodiversity conservation have fared across the UK in recent years. 2020 was a landmark year for NPMS volunteers because it marked the first ever contribution of NPMS data to a national biodiversity indicator. Specifically, NPMS data from 4 of the scheme's best surveyed broad habitats have been used to create a new indicator for category C7 plants of the wider countryside. The indicator is still classified as an experimental indicator, and future work is happening on it as we speak. However, getting to that point in only 6 years of field surveys highlights the incredible dedication of NPMS volunteers in getting out into the countryside and establishing and surveying habitat plots in order for us to understand changes to our environment. Therefore, now heading into its 7th year, as I said, there is huge potential for future analysis to show change in plant communities over time. Just released today, there is a little video, actually it was a couple of weeks ago now, a little video and infographic in order to better understand what this infographic means. So you can see it on our YouTube channel. Otherwise, we've also produced this infographic, as I mentioned. So it shows you clearly here the 4 broad scale habitat types that we've been mainly focused on at this point. And as I said, it is still experimental, but they are doing a lot of work on that at the moment. So as you can see on the map, all the NPMS squares are either orange, which means they have been allocated to a volunteer, or blue, which means they are currently unallocated. To date, we have 1,756 squares allocated, meaning some volunteers take on more than 1 square. You may have seen the map like this on the website when looking for a square near me page. As you can see, there are still a lot of blue ones, particularly in the more remote areas. However, we are working on ways to encourage a greater uptake of squares in these areas through working with organisations such as the Mountain Training Association, Cairngorms National Park, Snowdonia Society, Lake District and Peak District National Parks, for example. It is worth mentioning at this point that if you've gone to look for a square only to find that they are all orange near you, meaning that they are already allocated, please don't be too disheartened. Squares are released fairly frequently by volunteers leaving the scheme or moving geographically, for example. Sometimes volunteers are thrilled by the idea of sharing a square, or simply they took it on, but life has gotten in the way and now they want to release it. In which case, if you do contact us, if you can't find one that is near you that is suitable, as we can contact the volunteer who currently has it. We also have plans to release more squares in areas where 70% of the squares are already allocated. So to revisit, the aim is to provide reliable measures of change for individual species and species groups within semi-natural habitats, and to use both positive and negative indicator species for each habitat. The species included in the scheme were chosen to be reliable indicators, species which are widespread and are relatively easy to identify. As I have said, the survey design needs to be straightforward, repeatable, and achievable by volunteers. So to look more into the basics, once a surveyor has been randomly allocated 1 kilometre square or monad, as in they've selected that square, but it's a randomly allocated square originally, they are then to establish 5 plots, ideally 3 square and 2 linear. We'll go much more in detail in the plots bit further on. Plots should represent different NPMS habitats. Surveyors record the abundance of indicator species and any other background information. This survey is carried out twice a year, once in late spring or early summer, and then once again in late summer. So once a volunteer has requested and been allocated a square, they receive a welcome pack with survey guidance notes, a species ID guide, species and habitat lists, survey forms, and a map of their 1 kilometre square. The ID book was specifically created for the scheme and is compact and concise, organised into flower colour. However, volunteers can and do supplement with their own ID books of choice. The guidance notes explains the details of the methodology. The species lists show which species are to be recorded for each habitat dependent on survey level. You can also see the recording forms tucked behind, which once used in the field are used for uploading the data on the website. However, we do have a nifty app that can be used directly in the field to record data. It is worth noting that presently, if any of you are new to the scheme and have had your requested square approved, you will likely have only received a digital copy of these resources so far. This is because I've not been back in the office since the first week in January due to the lockdown. As soon as we're open to the office again, I will be sorting packs and posting out, although I may be there for several days at this rate. So we recommend a reconnaissance visit to identify NPMS habitats and establish plots and record your plot locations so they can be relocated. Check there aren't previously allocated plots in your square on the website. We have currently advised that due to lockdown situation, although easing in some areas, it is worth checking with your country-specific regulations. We do no way want our volunteers to put themselves at any risk. Do what feels comfortable with you. However, if you are following footpaths or lanes and using OS maps, it's a good way that you can start to get a picture of what your square is like and who might own parts of it and what is the access like and where do these NPMS habitats extend to. So once a square has been allocated, you may have had a look on online maps. Maybe you've done your square recce, and then you need to start considering the landowner permission side of things. Survey dates will then need to be agreed with the landowner as required. I'm currently working on a few ways that we can help with the landowner permission side of things, but as you can see here, we have a few tips, including Google Maps, so satellite maps, which is my personal favourite. You just literally search around Street View or having a look at whether there's any Google addresses on there for local contacts or even just farm addresses. It's really useful for that. Or is it already owned by the council or national park or national trust? In which case we have great links with all these organisations and they will be more than happy for you to go and survey on their land. On our website, we do also have permission letters and a thank you letter that you can download and send to the landowner that you think might own it. However, if you are really stuck and you really don't know who owns a site or you're getting nowhere, then please do contact us and we can see if we can help you along with that side of things. The main points to consider when thinking about plots are that we suggest you aim for 3 square 5 by 5 metre plots for normal habitat types and 2 linear 1 by 25 metre plots. The pre-selected plot locations on your 1 kilometre map are recommended if possible to avoid site selection bias. I'll come onto the pre-selected plots in a moment. Surveys should only be carried out in NPMS habitats, and ideally each plot should be located in a different habitat. This is, however, difficult if A, your square has no apparent NPMS habitat on it, which I know some of the maps are sent out do look like that, or B, the whole square is only one NPMS habitat type. In these cases, firstly, the mapping data used to generate where NPMS habitat data is can be inaccurate and not give a true representation of what is on the ground. Therefore, don't assume that there isn't any habitat there, and that's why we recommend a square reconnaissance. Also, it's useful to have a look at the Google satellite imagery, as you can see little pockets of NPMS habitat sometimes from that. If you only have one NPMS habitat type, for example, heathland or bog or wet heath, then you will only be able to record in that habitat type. But where possible, we were asking if you can choose different habitat types. On average, across all scheme monads, around 4 plots are surveyed per kilometre square. Therefore, do not panic if you can't find 5 plots or even 4. The reason for all these apparent strict rules and regulations is that by following the guidance as well as you can, we aim to reduce bias and ensure that the data is statistically robust. So just to give you a brief overview of how 5 survey plots are selected before I go into more detail. So square maps provided to each allocated volunteer will look something a bit like this. The pre-selected numbered plot locations are randomised, and the 1 kilometre grid squares are random but are selected with a bias towards those with NPMS habitats in them. If possible, it is recommended, as I say, that you use these numbered plot locations. As you can imagine, if we were always able to choose our exact plot locations, we may very well end up choosing the rather nice patch of orchids in the corner of the grassland. And as lovely as that would be, if scaled up nationally, this would give a misrepresentation of what is really happening to our habitats on the ground. If your plot is boring, we understand that this can be frustrating, but that's why we go on walks and visit nature reserves to see beautiful plants, and maybe send our records in to iRecord or to our local BSBI recorder. These sometimes boring NPMS plots are how we are measuring the health of our habitats, and it is so vitally important. In the guidance notes, you will also see Protocol A regarding self-selecting plots. This can be done if there are reasons why you cannot use the numbered ones due to factors like safety, access, where NPMS habitat is, for example. Protocol A suggests that you locate your plot in NPMS habitat, but more specifically in an area of the habitat that matches the average or typical representative. This grid plan crib sheet can be downloaded off the NPMS website, and it helps you to show how to locate your numbered plots. By using the numbers along each side and the number ID for your square, you can then get an accurate grid reference for that numbered plot, which then, using a GPS device or an app on your phone, you can locate it on the ground. Bearing in mind that this can sometimes be variable if using a phone app like I've got, for example, and GPS units will be more accurate, but I don't own a GPS unit, so you're very lucky if you do. A quick overview of the plot setup. So whilst on site, you want to use fixed landmarks to record the plot location, and that would be sort of a grouping of trees or a certain hill or feature that's going to be there for a long time, basically. You want to only set up temporary markers, as we don't want to leave anything behind, countryside code and all that. Then you want to record the grid reference, make a plot sketch with a written description, and it's also useful to take an annual photograph from the same point or angles each year. Linear plots can be along an arable field margin, hedgerow or watercourse. Woodland plots are larger at 10 by 10 metres. This plot setup is done on the website after your square recce, and once done in the first year, then it is set up and ready to be simply surveyed twice a year, every year after that. We do offer a lot of support and guidance on this stage. We now have a YouTube video guiding people how to do this part. We now have this, we also have a start of a mini video series that's going to be on the whole aspect of this on all how to set up on the desk-based stuff and how to do the plot setup and how to do your first survey, for example. So keep watching, it will be helping you along. So here you can see my kit. I have my trusty Weather Writer clipboard that only has some degree of mould from all my plant specimens stuffed into it over the years. I have my marked bamboo canes, which is what I use as my markers. I simply tore up some scraps of fabric to make the flags on the ends so that they're more visible. I then have a ball of yarn or wool, and I've already pre-measured the wool at 5 metre intervals before I went out, and marked each interval with another scrap of fabric tied around, but equally you can measure once on site. So using your little kit, you'll want to place an initial marker and measure the first side of your square with the pre-measured string, tape measure, or even pacing it out. The clipboard is used to create the 90-degree angle at each corner, so you don't end up with a square sort of, well, more like a parallelogram, because it'd be all wonky instead of a square. It's then in the southwest corner that you take your photo, you get your grid reference, and you draw your plot sketch. So just to show you what it really looks like, this was in my garden, so that's why it looks like such short turf. Hopefully this is useful to see in slightly more detail. However, we do now have the Don't Lose the Plot Over Plots YouTube video on this specifically, with me setting up a plot in a nearby Lowland grassland site. We recommend positioning your plot so that it is parallel to a fence or path or hedge or any feature like that that will help you sort of to relocate your plot following on. If you do it at an angle, it's going to be difficult to get your plot in exactly the right position the next year. You then use cord or rope, or like I've used wool, to align the first side of your square. And as I said, using the clipboard or book to create that right angle so that you can do that first corner. And then remember to put your corner markers in as you go. And once you've completed all this, then you'll have your lovely setup plot, and you can take your photo from the southwest corner, do your plot sketch, and take your grid reference. Most linear plots are usually 1 by 25 metres for mostly arable field margins, standing and running water, rock outcrops, screes, road verges and hedgerows. Ideally, you want these linear plots to cover the part of the feature that intersects with an internal or boundary grid line on your 1 kilometre square map. Again, I go slightly more detail in the video about that, but it essentially means that wherever you've got one of the pre-numbered plots that actually on a grid line, you want the linear feature to be crossing that grid line, and you start your plot from that point where it crosses the grid line, and then you go the 25 metres out from that point. Your plot should start at the point where the feature intersects, and then from any direction from there. You use 2 markers to establish the 1 metre width, and then using cord or rope or a tape measure or pacing it out, mark the 25 metres in length. Now, using your GPS device or the app on your phone, you take the grid reference from the start of the plot and the finishing part of the plot. So you have 2 grid references for a linear plot. You then want to take a photo from outside of the plot showing the surroundings. If the linear feature is shorter than 25 metres, then just record the entirety of it and note the length it is. There are separate sections in the guidance notes on linear features, specifically for vertical plots or for rock outcrops, cliff bases or screes. Again, there are further details about linear arable field margins in the guidance notes regarding which arable crops are not to be recorded, like for biofuel crops. And as you can see on the diagram, it is the naturally occurring field margin we are interested in. This is with arable fields, not the sown areas that are for bird food or wildflowers, because obviously in a lot of agri-environment schemes now, they plant a sort of width of a nice field margin full of pollinator species and that sort of thing, which is not obviously natural because somebody's planted it. So you will want to start your plot actually not including that bit, but the very edge of where the crops are, because all those native arable rare plants, for example, are going to be occurring at that point in amongst the crops really, rather than the bit that's already been cultivated, like with sown seed. So just to recap, you've done your square recce, you have your landowner permissions for the areas that need it, and you've chosen which plots you want to use, and you've successfully located your chosen plots, set them up and recorded your GPS for each. So you have your sketch map and a photo for each plot as well. Now, all of this can be done before a survey, maybe during another square recce, or can be done as you're about to start your first survey for your first visit. Either way, once you get back to the computer, you will need to set up your plots on the website before you can actually start entering the plant data directly. Equally, this has to be done on the website before you can start recording in the field with the app. Whichever is easiest, it's totally up to you. But as you can see from the form, it has a section for your sketch map and the grid reference for each plot. There is a handy step-by-step presentation on how to create the plots on the website on our YouTube channel, which is a bit of a boring video because it is just watching somebody else using a website, but it does take you through each of those steps on how to set up your plot. So it is well worth watching if that's something you're not clear on. So each volunteer, prior to recording the species in the field, will need to decide at which level that they wish to survey at. So all the forms and the app can be used for any of the different levels. So wildflower level has about 212 easily identifiable species divided into lists applicable for each habitat. So it's usually about 10 to 15 species per habitat. Then there's indicator level, which is a slightly expanded list. We've got the 408 species divided into groups applicable for habitats again, including some species which are slightly more challenging to identify, e.g. grasses, sedges, ferns, for example. So roughly 30 species per habitat. Inventory level, which is designed for volunteers who are capable of recording all vascular plant species of which they find in that habitat. Wildflower, as I said, is the relatively simpler level in that there's a reduced list. So if we look at a specific example, dry deciduous woodland, which is a fine habitat, has 20 species that need to be identified at wildflower level, so slightly more than the 10 to 15 that I said. These include wild garlic, hazel, cleavers, ivy, holly, etc. At indicator level, there is an expanded list of species to record. For example, in dry deciduous woodland, there's 30. With the additions of wood sedge, wood millet, and wood speedwell, for example. And as I said, inventory level is recording all species present within the plot, and that includes any that aren't flowering, so you need to know your vegetation quite well. So as I briefly said, there are 28 fine NPMS habitats split across the 11 broad habitat categories. So we always ask you, you obviously have to know which broad habitat you're in, but we do ask if you can work out which fine habitat you're in, it's going to make the data that much more valuable. There are a range of positive and negative indicator species. And as I said, species were selected on a basis of a compromise between their reliability as positive or negative indicators, how widespread they are nationally, and the ease of identification. If you have very few indicators in your plot, maybe it's one of those boring plots that I mentioned, it doesn't matter, that information is still useful and important. You may want to record other species, but this information is really useful, but won't be used to assess change in the habitat quality. It's worth noting that sometimes your habitat type in your plot actually may change to a different habitat type over time. So it's worth always just doing a reassessment of what fine habitat have you got that year. So this is obviously the guidance notes, the one that I've obviously talking for a lot of the information from. And if you read it cover to cover, really detailed, you will be an expert in NPMS monitoring because it really has got everything in there. But sometimes it is useful just to listen to somebody like myself, go through some of it and break it down with visuals, and obviously at the end be able to answer some questions. So just to go a little bit more into the breakdown of the habitat types. So as I said, we've got the broad scale habitat. So in this case, we've got broadleaf woodland, which then subdivides back into dry deciduous woodland, hedgerows of native species, and wet woodland. So if you've got any woodland plots in your square, or you're thinking of doing some, it might be useful for you to attend our webinar on the 27th of April at 10 o'clock with Ben Averis. He's going to be delivering a whole webinar on this habitat type and going into all the different species that you'll want to be looking out for and how to work out which of those 3 fine habitats you've got. Ben Averis is also going to be delivering his training on pinewood and juniper scrub again on the 18th of May at 10 AM. All of these are all on the website. And we also have the new ecologist Hannah Gibbon's delivering the arable field margins training, which is actually next Thursday at 2 o'clock. So that's the 22nd of April. So do register for that one if you've got any arable field margins that you're not sure of in your square. Just check. Oh, sorry, I thought I went back too far. So we also have several Lowland Grassland training webinars this year presented by Dominic Price from the Species Recovery Trust. We've got dry acid grassland and heathland on the 21st of May at 7 p.m, neutral damp grassland and neutral pastures on the 28th of May at 7 o'clock, and dry calcareous grasslands on the 11th of June at 7 o'clock. So they're all evening ones for the Lowland Grassland ones, but again, they'll all be recorded and they'll all be uploaded onto the YouTube channel, and their presentations will be annotated and added to the website also. Ben Averis will be coming again, who's a bit of a favourite of ours, to deliver the habitat training on upland grassland habitats on the 29th of June at 10 a.m. And the Heathland one, also Ben Averis will be delivering another one on that one as well, the same as last year, but also the Grassland one will be covering a little bit of Heathland. We've got bog and wet heath, which obviously broken down into blanket bog, raised bog and wet heath. Ben Averis will be doing his training again later on in the year. All of the dates are on the website and you can book them from now. And this year we've, Ben Averis is going to be doing the marsh and fen again. So we've got acidic fens, flushes, mires and springs, and base-rich fens, flyers, mushes and springs. Now, particularly, I've always found sometimes the marsh and fen quite a difficult habitat actually to really get your head around. So I'm quite looking forward to the training myself with Ben. And this year we're going to have some freshwater training looking at the differences between nutrient poor lakes and ponds and nutrient rich lakes and ponds, and obviously rivers and streams. And that's going to be delivered by a freshwater specialist ecologist called Sue Bell. So it's worth signing up for that one as well if you have a look on the website. Ben Averis will be doing his rock outcrops, cliffs and screes as well. And he's also producing us a brand new training session this year for coastal habitats. So again, there's a whole range: coastal salt marsh, coastal sand dunes, coastal vegetated shingle, macaire, which I'm never really sure how to pronounce, to be honest, maritime cliff tops and slopes. And macaire actually is one that's really, really underrepresented in NPMS habitats. There's a lot of it on some of the islands. So, you know, if you've got any of that in your plots, then do try and get in your squares, then do try and set up a plot on that habitat type if you know what it is. And so this is what the species list guidance book looks like. So as you can see, you've got the list of all the species down the one side. They are ordered in Latin name, unfortunately, rather than the common name in alphabetical order. But it's a fairly short list, so you can sort of have a look through. You've then got the column which says WF, which stands for wildflower, and it has a little black flower symbol in it. Now, wherever there is a black flower symbol in that column, that means that that's the one that you need to record at wildflower level. If you're doing indicator level, you need to be able to record all of the ones on this list. And inventory, it would be all of the plants in the UK, so we wouldn't obviously have that listed out. And then the page number refers to the guide, the ID guide, and then the fine habitats says which other fine habitats that you might find those species in, because obviously a lot of these ones are going to occur in multiple different habitats. Just to tell you a little bit about where you might get some further support and training for these things. Obviously, we've got the ID guide that we've produced that you can have, and as I said, it's organised into flower colour. You've obviously got the other very popular ID guide books. The Wildflower Key by Frances Rose is definitely a popular one. I personally use the Collins guide because it's got grasses and sedges and ferns in it as well. Also online, the BSBI and the Species Recovery Trust, they either have a lot of really useful little crib sheets for learning all these things, but they also have little YouTube videos for some of these species ID specifically. So do have a look at those web resources. Also, when actual face-to-face training is allowed to happen again, places like the Field Studies Council, I mean, I know they're doing a lot of online ones at the moment as well. They do some excellent training programs, and also you might find that your local wildlife trust ones do as well. And NPMS do some excellent in-field face-to-face training as well, and we're going to be running a little bit maybe further on later this year, but stay tuned for that. Obviously we're waiting for further guidance on the current global situation. So just to go into a little bit more detail on the actual forms. So everyone has the same kind of form if you've got one of the paper forms. So it doesn't matter whether you're doing any of the levels. As you can see, we just want you to indicate which level you're doing when you're there, which is really important because it makes a difference, obviously, for if you're putting that information on the website as to which part of the website you use. It wants your grid references for your plot details. It wants to know the broad habitat, the fine habitat. It then wants to know about your slope and what direction does it face, how steep your plot is, management types, which obviously can change each year between visits. Whether, if there is grazing, whether it's low, moderate or high intensity. Again, there's a little bit of description about that. How wooded is your plot and the vegetation height, and then the additional comments down below, which can be whatever you want to include that you feel that might be useful information. And on the back of the form, you've then got the plot sketches and the photos that you want to put in for every visit. And then the main part at the bottom, obviously, is your species list, where you want to put your name and you want to put your DOMIN scale, which it gives you a little brief understanding of where your DOMIN scale is. So as you can see, it's a range of percentages that you estimate of cover, but I'll go into that a little bit more next. So using the relevant species list for the levels and the habitat that you're in, you search your plot and see what species might be present. So it might be worth starting in one corner of your plot and then gradually moving out to the rest of the square. And remember, try not to trample the plants too much. So try and look at as much as you can from outside of your plot as you can. Regarding noting the DOMIN scale, which sounds a bit scary, but it really isn't, it's simply a way of estimating the amount of ground that each species takes up as a percentage of the total area of the plot. So don't forget the leaves, and it's not just the flowers. And remember to look beneath larger plants in case there are some hiding beneath, as they do grow in layers. So I've tried to break this down, this DOMIN part, down for you slightly. So as you can imagine, this part can be very subjective, but as long as you are consistent across all of your survey sites, then try not to worry if your version of 5% is more like someone else's 15%. However, as you can see, each score is within a range of percentages, allowing for some variability. So I've used this image of a gorgeous meadow that's near me, as if it is your square and you were at your plot and you were looking down at it. So if you imagine that all the rough hawk bit, which are the yellow ones, were all squished together, but remembering to include the leaves and not just the flowers, of which the leaves are quite substantial, then you estimate what percentage of the square that would take up. Now, the species mix here isn't huge, as it's fairly dominated by these three species: salad bonnet, rough hawkbit and oxeye daisy, with some small numbers of fairy flax in there. But there may well have been other individuals or several individuals of other species, but I can't see them in the photo and I simply can't remember off the top of my head. So remember, you don't have to get to 100%. It's not like you're working out the percentage of a sort of pizza pie on a plate, because there's going to be areas of bare ground, etc. But also the species are not all going to be present in the same plane. They're in levels of structure and height. The guidance notes suggest that you imagine or even bring with you a square that is 50 by 50 centimetres, as this represents 1% of the 5 by 5 metre square. If you had enough of one species that would fit into more than one of these size squares, but no more than 4, then you have a score of 3, for example. So you can do it this way, but I promise you, over time, this technique is something that you will just get better and better at over time and more confident with. Regarding aspect and slope, if the plot occurs on a slope, record the main direction that the slope is facing from the normal compass range, for example, north or northeast, and then try to record the main slope angle. So flat is 0 to 5%, moderate is 6 to 30%, and steep is more than 30%. Management is sometimes very obvious and other times not so much. Are there livestock evidence? Are there livestock there, evidence of ditch clearance, hedge cutting, coppicing, etc.? If there is evidence of grazing or livestock, how intense is it? High, very short vegetation with no real stems or plants and lots of dung, etc. Is it moderate, which means there's evidence of grazing, but vegetation height is variable with a mix of taller and shorter areas? Or low, which evidence is much reduced and there's not much, the most vegetation is quite tall. Again, it's DOMIN scale for bare soil, etc., and you just give a score for each based on your estimate. So these extra parts of the recording forms and the process are all ways that we help with data interpretation later on. So we've got height classes for vegetation, and then also like how wooded, and in the woodland, for example, this vegetation height measure is for the shrub layers only and not the canopy, because obviously that would be very high. So just a bit of an equipment list that you might want to take out with you in the field. So you're going to have your survey forms or your app. You're going to have your guidance notes and species lists. You might have an OS map with you. You've got your clipboard and your pencils, maybe your tape measure and your string for your plot setup and your plot corner markers. You might have some ID guides and a hand lens. The last few, sort of compass, GPS device, camera and phone, are probably all the one item if you're anything like me. And then also really important thing to think about is consider your health and safety. So this is obviously particularly important as we want you to stay safe above all else. So please do not survey large bodies of water alone if possible. And obviously don't try to get in and see what that plant is that's just out of reach. It's just a plant, it's not worth it risking your safety for. Make sure that somebody knows where you are and how long you're expected to take, and maybe where your car is parked. Maybe have an arrangement with somebody to let them know when you arrive on site and when you are leaving, and then have a strategy in place for what for them to call you if they've not received notification from you after a set amount of time, and then what to do next. Do they call other contacts or do they call the emergency services, for example? And in these days of the pandemic, obviously keep in mind social distancing and maybe have some hand sanitizer with you or something. So there's a lot of help on the website for data entry with step-by-step guides, YouTube videos, etc. There's also a specific webinar for data entry, so please do register for that if you haven't already. We've also set up data surgeries, which are one-to-one sessions that you can book onto, and a slot will be sort of offered to you where you can speak with either me or Abby about your specific data queries. And you can always email me or even maybe contact a local mentor as well. And the Facebook support group is always there to help people that are new to the scheme and maybe want a few tips and tricks, etc. So there are two ways to submit your data, is via the website or via the app. So as I mentioned before, the app just needs you to have your plot set up on the website before you can start recording in the field. If you're concerned about phone signal, which I know a lot of people are, especially if they're in more remote areas, then don't worry, because the app basically is set up to work offline as if needed, and then sends the data when the signal is back in range again. And again, do come to the webinar if you want to know exactly how to do all of those bits. So just to show you what happens with your data and how incredibly important it is, and it really is being used in proper important policy making kind of science. So it's not, you know, it's highly important, your data. Other ways to find support. So on our website, we've got a huge resources guide with frequently asked questions, species crib sheets, links to other species things. We've got our landowner access section. We've got our list of mentors that so you can contact them and where they're located. And also we're on all of the social media platforms as well. So there's lots of ways to get support out of there. Obviously, in normal non-COVID years, we set up face-to-face training all over the UK with a local expert trainer in sort of botanical field studies, but also somebody that can take you through the specific methodologies, that can deliver a short bit of theory inside and then out in the field with plot setup and recording. So we are planning on a handful of these for later in the year, but obviously we're not going to get everywhere and we're not going to have huge numbers to be booked on, unfortunately, just because of restrictions on numbers. But in normal years, there would be a lot more of these happening. So we also have a lovely bunch of mentors that I mentioned that are well distributed across the UK, and they can help with queries on methodology, data and ID, and you can find your nearest mentor and their contact details on the website. And we're always on the lookout for new mentors too. So if you feel that you can share your skills and knowledge, maybe if that is based more on the technical side of things, like using the website and entering data than it is the plant side of things, then please still consider being a mentor, as this area of is a lot where a lot of volunteers do sometimes need extra help with the getting started at the beginning. And obviously I'm always here at the end of a phone or email, and obviously Abby as well. So if you want to find out any more about the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, if you haven't already visited the website and registered, please do go. And also you can follow us on all of the social media platforms as well. So now we've come to that point, I think maybe it's time. Abby, do you want to join the show with your camera and sound? And we can start going through some questions if you're amenable to that.
Yep, that's no problem.
Okay.
So I've been answering some as we've gone along, but if you haven't had your question answered, it was just because I thought a broader range of people might be particularly interested in that question.
Okay.
I'll go with the ones first that I've noted down from the chat, so we don't kind of lose them if more come in on the chat.
Yeah.
First. So a lot of interest in access to the slides. So this recording will be put on the YouTube channel. You can either find it just by simply going into YouTube, type in NPMS channel, and it comes up straight away. Or I've put the link in this chat function. If you scroll up, you should be able to still find it.
Right.
I know you were saying, Sarah, that the slides for like Ben's presentations will be put online and annotated. Are these slides for the introduction presentations? Will they also be accessible?
Yeah, so I mean, there currently is obviously an older version of this training PDF, so PowerPoint, that's already on the website. And the plan is that I'm going to narrate this one that I've just delivered and upload that as a PDF that's got narrations on. And all of the ones that our trainers are doing this year will be uploaded in a similar way. So there'll be a narrated PowerPoint, as well as then the recorded webinar from the training session on our YouTube channel, which I'm then probably going to get embedded in the website as well. So there should be multiple ways in which you can record, like watch these presentations and get the information.
That's great. So there was a question on how do you determine the start and end of a linear plot?
So as I was saying briefly, if you want, I mean, ideally we want people to use the numbered ones that are on your grid square already, and you want to find where that numbered plot is, where that's on a grid line, and where the linear feature crosses the grid line will be where you want to start the linear plot, and then the 25 meters can go sort of in the west or east or southwest direction from that point. Obviously it can be tricky, because I would say, I don't know if you found this, Abby, but not every linear feature is going to cross a grid line at exactly the point where you've got a numbered plot. So, you know, if you found that you've got a linear feature and it crosses a grid line, but it doesn't match up with your number on your grid square, that's fine, as long as you still start it at that point where it crosses that grid line. And from there, you go the 25 meters following the curve of the water course or the field edge or whatever it is.
Yep. Sorry, I'd also add, if there's a chance that the linear feature doesn't cross your grid lines or across your numbers, we still encourage you to do a linear plot. So yeah, the best kind of thing would be maybe to have a look along your linear plot and then it would be self-selection, but try and not go for the really good bit, the bit that kind of represents the whole linear feature more.
Yeah, no, that's
kind
good.
of avoid bias in that way. Sonny's asking, can you change squares if there is a blue square available in another location? So if you do, you've kind of looked whether it's access reasons or it's too far away now, or you just want to change your square, you can do that if there's another one available. So the easiest way, correct me if I'm wrong here, Sarah, is probably for you to allocate yourself the new square you want. So you can do that yourself on the website, just the same way you allocated the first one, and then email Sarah to relinquish the one you do not want.
Well, and volunteers can actually remove a square themselves. So if you're logged into the website, you can just go under my account and it'll have my squares, and you want to go onto that, and then they'll have a section where you, next to your square that you don't want anymore, it will simply have a button that says remove, and you can click that and that will just release your square. So I don't even have to do it for you.
That's even easier.
Yeah, exactly. But do, you know, if maybe secure the one that you want first, and bear in mind that whenever you request a square, it has to be then authorised by myself, which I do roughly once a week. I go in and see the new square requests and authorise them and send out the maps and things like that. So yeah, you can do that if you found a different square that fits, definitely.
Okay. But, somebody asking, where do estuaries fit in terms of, I suppose, NPMS habitats?
Well, they're going to be probably under the coastal side of it. So, I mean, most estuaries probably come under the coastal salt marsh, I would have thought, but have a good look at in your guidance notes and look under the coastal section and basically look and see if what you've been looking at on the ground fits the descriptions that are in the habitat descriptions, essentially, because quite often it's worth use to, you know, for example, you get to coastal salt marshes here and it has a description about it. You could then get your species list book and find coastal salt marshes in here and look at the sort of assemblage of species and look at what's on the ground and see if that sort of fits, basically. Would you say that's about right, Abby?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And also come to the coastal training as well, because that will help.
Okay, so somebody's asking a similar question about selecting squares. So asking if it's possible to do it outside your 30-mile postcode. So when you're on that request a square page, you're correct in thinking when you type in your postcode, it is kind of limited currently to 30 miles. But if you wanted to look for a square outside of that 30 miles, or even if you said here near a relative's house in a different part of the UK, that's perfectly fine. What you have to do is click return all squares, and then you can see all the squares in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And then you can do the same allocation of that way.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, that's how you can do it, and just look at all squares and zoom into that area. Exactly. I'll just try and get to some of the questions that were so this is the reasoning behind why the squares that have been chosen and notice that you haven't in your area. This is often a common thing that we get asked, which is essentially the squares are done on a randomized but with a bias towards where there's semi-natural habitat, that's NPMS habitat, for example. So it is sort of almost done by like a computer, really. It's not somebody sort of fixing points out. And as I said, we do release more squares in areas where, say, they've already been taken up. If it's just that there's literally no squares that are nearby, that is really annoying and frustrating, and we totally understand that. But it's just part of the robustness of the methodology and the sort of data that we get from it. It just has to follow this kind of method. So yeah, it's a bit of a difficult one if there really isn't one close to you, but it might not be that way going forward in the future. More squares might be added. Equally, something that we're looking to do is use the methodology of NPMS to sort of sell it as a sort of idea, not sell it, but local recording organisations might start using the methodology for their specific projects. So national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, the people who run those, and they will then add more squares in for those specific areas that won't go into the national data set, but they will still require volunteers to come and survey these methods there, and it will be helping for local recording and that sort of thing. So there will always be opportunities in the future, I think.
Somebody's asking about saying their square has a lot of other habitat in it and asking really what they should do. So they're correct in thinking, oh, sorry, you can't see this. So they're saying, I assume I look to see if this is indeed a habitat listed and then treat it as such, otherwise don't use. So that's completely correct. These maps you are provided are as up to date as they can be, but they still might be outdated, or the satellite imagery hasn't picked up quite the NPMS habitat. So definitely have a recce of your square and have a look to see if the other habitat actually includes any useful NPMS habitat. And if so, you can use that. But then if it's still not one of the NPMS habitats, unfortunately, you can't use that part. And you could be looking to more doing linear transects along hedgerows,
yeah,
or other linear features.
I mean, yeah, it's often that, you know, this other habitat that it says is just because we don't really know, and having a look on the ground, or even just a bit of the Google beforehand, you can often find little areas that probably do come under NPMS habitat. Excuse me. Caroline's asked, most of my square is on MOD land, no access permitted. So it's a bit difficult one, this one, because obviously if it's a dangerous area, they're not going to let you on. But we do work quite closely with the MOD. So Caroline, if you wanted to get in touch with us directly, then we might be able to establish some access for you. Otherwise, yes, if you can do linear plots in the areas that are still available, then that's fine as well. But do get in contact regarding your square. I was trying to read them as without going too quiet.
Somebody asking about the GPS, any suitable apps for GPS?
I have one that was free, just called Grid Reference Finder, and in the settings you can have it to set to the 10 figure grid reference, because otherwise it defaults, I think, to the 6 figure. So you just have to go into the settings and change it to display the full 10 figures. You've done that one. Oh, Gemma just said she missed what we were saying about receiving a pack. Yes, so essentially all I've been managing to do is send out digital versions of the packs at the moment. I'm just waiting to hear about our office opening, and as soon as it is, I'm going to have a couple of days there sending out packs to anyone who's owing one, basically. So apologies that it's slightly later than one would hope, but that is the status of things at the moment, isn't it? What habitat does road verge come under? So that's often a common one, actually, and it's something that might change in the future with the emphasis on road verge management, particularly within plant life. But at the moment, road verge isn't a subcategory of habitat, so to speak. You would do it as a linear plot and then record the linear plot as the habitat type, which in most cases is going to be one of the lowland grassland categories. So basically it will be like a neutral pastures and meadows kind of fine habitat, but for a linear plot, essentially.
What would the best way to go about finding out who owns the land in my NPMS square? So there's this is a very common question asking about land ownership. Essentially, there's multiple ways. Kind of the first thing would definitely be to have a look on Google. There might be kind of businesses, or you can see it's on National Trust land. You can also see on the NPMS website whether it is on National Trust land, an AONB, a national park. And if you are lucky enough to be on one of them, I would definitely just contact the park directly, because the manager of the park is going to have a very good idea, if it's not the National Trust itself and they're working with a landowner, how to get a hold of that landowner. They can even potentially put you in touch as well directly. But other businesses might be near that have an idea who owns the field behind them. It might even be them. Another way is to go to houses. Obviously, with COVID, you've got to be very mindful of this. But you could simply knock on doors and people would have an idea, if it's not their land, oh, it's my neighbour down the road kind of thing. The post office as well might be able to help in terms of that.
Yeah. And then Julia just asked specifically about farmland. So again, you know, you'd be able to just look at the nearest farmhouse and find the address and maybe just send out one of the letters to them. Equally, I saw Joe in the chat mentioning about land registry. So yes, to get full title deeds and things, you do need to pay to use land registry, but equally you can go on and look at and it'll give you an address of the area that basically owns that piece of land if you zoom right into it. So I had one of our volunteers contact me the other day saying that she would like to know who owns a certain piece of land. She thought it was maybe all under an estate ownership. And simply with the land registry, I could zoom right in very, very, very close and click on it, and it gave me the farm address that owns it. Basically, it doesn't give you name and number or anything like that, but it gives you that address, so that can be a starting point. And yes, as Joe says, it is only £3 per office copy, but we don't want to encourage you guys to all spending your own hard-earned money. You're doing this as a voluntary thing. And if we have a case where literally you cannot find out who owns it, you've tried every avenue and it's driving you up the wall, then come to me. I'll see how far I can get, and if needed, I will organise that £3. I will get the title deeds for you, and we will take that under cost of NPMS. We wouldn't expect volunteers to do that necessarily. Peter's asked, as very steep slope, 45 degrees in my square, should the size of the survey square still be 5 by 5 metres? I'm saying yes, I believe it should be, because unless it's a woodland, but I don't think it's a woodland on that. So it should still be the same size plot, despite the awkwardness of the slope. I mean, if you can't do it for safety reasons, then by all means choose a different plot location. But if you can safely do 5 by 5 meters, then yes.
What's the window of the
yeah.
first survey in terms of dates? So we haven't really set out strict dates due to it will vary depending on where you are in the United Kingdom. For instance, South England will be very different than also Scotland. And also it will depend on your habitats. For example, woodlands tend to start a lot of their flowering plants very early. Like you'd see in March, the forest floor is full of flowers, whereas habitats such as your bog, kind of the good survey time will be around September, October. So what we've kind of said is the first survey in early spring. So that's kind of your April, May, June time. And then your second survey would be your late summer. So kind of August, September, potentially October, depending on kind of the temperature in the year.
Joe's just saying about when should we be contacting landowners. I mean, I would say get on it now, because it can take quite a long time for people to get back to you, and obviously explain that, you know, I mean, it's difficult regarding COVID, because obviously if your square is far enough away that you think, oh no, I shouldn't really be traveling there, then don't. But certainly maybe you could start that conversation of permission for when you can go, you know, even if that's first visits in June, when hopefully all the restrictions are lifted. But I would say if you can start finding out who owns a site and contacting them, I would do it now, really, because it can take longer than you think.
And or if you don't feel comfortable, I know we were saying earlier about like knocking on doors, which we'd normally say, but if you don't feel comfortable, or you think it's not really the right time to be doing that, knocking on a stranger's door, then you could always, I wouldn't say post a letter in terms of spending money on postage stamps, or you might not have the exact address, but you could write a letter and then instead of knocking, just literally put it through their post box and leave. So that way you're kind of minimizing that face-to-face contact as well. Also, on the website, there is also a Northern Ireland postcard that's kind of got all the information the NPMS already set up, and you just need to fill in your details at your phone number that they can contact you on.
There's one here about she's a freshwater ecologist, and her square's 50% water, and she's good with aquatic plant ID. However, the loch is a reservoir, so it has really fluctuating water levels, and the margin, obviously, the sort of habitat is severely affected. Should she avoid any of the habitats impacted by the drawdown or flooding? And does NPMS need information on impacted habitats? I suppose we do, really. I mean, that's something that we're monitoring. If that's one of the areas within your square, I mean, obviously we say for fresh water that it should be a linear plot, with the view that you start it the 1 meter width from the normal water level and then 1 meter in towards the water. And that's going to be difficult if it's such a variable water level, but if you can figure out where it should or normally be and then monitor it from there, even if you're not getting very many results, it's still useful information. Would you agree?
I would agree. And also in the comments section of your plot, you could always put that information about the fluctuating water levels, and it would just give some kind of context to the data if it's like not quite what you'd expect.
Yeah, definitely.
There was a very similar question asking about
Sue McDonald, is that? Yeah, so the idea is that you're wanting to get the sort of almost true aquatic species rather than the sort of, well, and I mean, it would include perhaps some inundation vegetation, but it wouldn't necessarily be that bankside vegetation. So it is the true aquatic species that we're sort of looking at, really, so that are going to be on the very edge of the water itself or into the water, is what the guidance notes specify. So hopefully, and again, you know, we're going to have a specific freshwater training session, so I will make sure that I get full information from our scientists who develop the scheme so that we can answer those as well. Right, I think, do you think we've covered everyone? Do you think? We've done pretty well, and it is now 4 minutes past 1, so I'd say I hope that we've answered everyone's questions. We will be downloading the chats and the questions as well, so you know, if there's anything that we're not sure about, we can always try and contact you directly. Equally, do send us an email if you feel that we haven't answered your question. And yeah, this will all be put up on the website again, so you can rewatch it at your leisure, if there's any particular areas that you think need refreshing. So yeah, thank you so much for all coming. Thank you, Abby, for being the co-host, and enjoy the rest of your Friday afternoons, everyone. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Bye.